I am working on a point-and-click adventure game using Adventure Games Studio with my own pixel art graphics that I'm creating in Aseprite. And up until now I've been using one of the default user interfaces that Adventure Games Studio offers, which provides a two-click system for interacting and examining things, and it shows the list of inventory items that the player has picked up with two example objects when you move the mouse to the top of the screen. By the way, this setup is inspired by the game Beneath a Steel Sky by Revolution Software from 1994. The problem is, however, that especially the inventory list does not really match the overall look and feel that I intended for my game. And I also wanted to put some more thought into the cursor system and the best possible way in which the player can interact with the game environment. So I came up with my own custom version for a cursor system and its click interactions, and I redesigned the look and feel for the inventory and some other related in-game menus. To determine the best way for the player to interact with the game world, I took a look at how classical point-and-click adventure games have evolved over time in that regard. Early games were still influenced by text adventure games and featured a text parser, through which the player could type in the actions that the character should perform. This input method was used, for example, in early Sierra point-and-click adventure games such as Space Quest, Police Quest, or King's Quest. I personally grew up more with the games by Lucasfilm, which later became LucasArts. Those games featured the classical verb list to interact with the game world, which many games from other developers took over in a similar form. Some later games then moved away from the verb list and replaced it with a coin interface that pops up when you click on an object, which lets you then choose from a set of actions such as examine, interact, or talk. Towards the end of the golden era of point-and-click adventure games, interfaces became even more minimalistic and often featured a two or even one-click solution, with which the player only needs the left or right mouse button to either interact with or examine the game world. So I was wondering, which of those many options should I select for my game? Well, text input was not really an option for me. Yes, it does in theory provide the most creative freedom for players to experiment with the game world, but in practice it comes with a lot of problems, and in my opinion it is a way too dated form of user interaction. So what about verb lists? Well, while I've always been a big fan of games that featured a classical verb list, and those interfaces therefore have a lot of nostalgic value to me, I don't think that nostalgia alone makes up for the rather dated look and feel and the clunkiness of the controls. I mean, I would still like to convey a nostalgic feeling in my game, but I'd rather achieve that through its pixel art and not through a dated user interface. So sorry verb list, but you're out. A coin interface has the advantage that it only pops up when needed, so you can display more of the actual game world on screen compared to the previous solutions. But I think that this is still not the most user-friendly solution, because it still requires an additional click to show the menu before clicking again and selecting an action. In that regard, a more modern and minimalistic two-click solution works best, in which one action is directly available on the left mouse button and a secondary action is available on the right mouse button. One could argue that the possible interaction options then become more limited compared to the previous solutions, and I would agree. However, I think it depends on the type of game you're creating whether this is actually a problem or not. For games with a strong focus on complex and creative puzzle solving and less focus on narrative and story progression, this might indeed be a less suited solution. My game will have puzzle solving, however it will be mainly narrative driven, with a stronger focus on character arcs and story development, so having a more direct and comfortable two-click system seems the best approach to me here. However, I do not want to simply have interact on one of the mouse buttons and examine on the other button at all times. The reason for that is that this would introduce one of the classical problems that many point-and-click adventure games suffer from, namely the fact that many actions would have very generic responses, such as
I don't see anything special about it. I can't pick that up. I can't move it. Doesn't seem to open. Doesn't seem to close.
Nah.
It's a taxi.
Neat.
or something along those lines. Instead, I wanted to have a custom cursor that only shows the relevant actions for the object you're hovering over. Visually, I decided to split the cursor into a left and right part whenever there are two meaningful actions available. And I wanted to show just one cursor symbol whenever there is only one meaningful action available. Look at this table, for example. Assume that there's no meaningful interaction with the table other than examining it. My custom cursor system then only shows the examine option when hovering over the table, and that action can be triggered by either the left or the right mouse button. This way, there's no need for players to find out the hard way that interacting is not possible here. Instead of letting them click and listen to a generic message, the same information is already visible from the shown cursor options. As a second example, let's have a look at this door on the left, for which there are two valid actions available: opening it and examining it. So my cursor shows both options like this. After the player decided to open the door, I would still like to provide the option to close the door again. So in that case, the cursor changes and shows the option to exit the screen and interact with the door again, which in this case means closing it. With this system, I can remove most of the cases where a generic response would be displayed otherwise. But it is not the default way how cursors work in Adventure Game Studio, so I had to customize things a bit here. For each hotspot or object, I added a custom property, which I simply called cursor, which is a number that determines which version of the cursor should be displayed when hovering over the object in question. Now there's the option to add a function that gets executed whenever the player hovers over the object. So I could have used that one to change the cursor accordingly whenever this event gets triggered. However, I figured that this is not necessary to do over and over again for each and every hotspot or object, because the function behind that would always perform the same task. It would look at the custom cursor property that I introduced and change the cursor accordingly. So instead, I added a general function called update mouse cursor, which does exactly that. And I placed it in a script called global script, which Adventure Game Studio provides for globally available and generic features like this one. The only thing I then had to do to update the mouse cursor based on the object underneath it was to call my new function from another built-in function called repeatedly execute, which, as its name indicates, gets called continuously during the game loop. This way, the cursor gets updated correctly based on the cursor property of each object without having to manually set this up for each and every object again and again. So far so good. But how could I now determine which action should actually be triggered based on mouse button clicks? Because those should also dynamically change based on what action the current cursor provides, right? To achieve that, for each object or hotspot, instead of directly linking functions to the event of interacting or examining, I only linked a function to the generic AnyClick event. This function gets called no matter which mouse button was clicked while hovering over the object. The information which button was clicked does, however, get passed to that function, which is this cursor mode parameter here. So what I did in this function then was to essentially translate the received mouse button click to whatever action is determined by the mouse cursor visual. So for example, if the cursor visual shows exit screen on the left and interact on the right, a left mouse button click gets translated to the exit screen action, and a right mouse button click gets translated to the interact action. This is achieved by another custom function that I added to the global script called getModeFromCursor, which works on both hotspots and objects in the same way. It simply checks the cursor property and then determines in another function which action belongs to the combination of cursor and mouse button click that is received. Again, since this is a function in the global script, I only had to set it up once to be usable by all hotspots and objects in the same way from now on. So far, this system works as intended, and I will keep testing it while further developing my game. Let me know what you guys think. Is this indeed a user-friendly way to control a point-and-click game, or do you have another preferred solution that you might have seen in another game? Let me know down in the comments and I will be happy to check them out. But now on to the more pixel art related side of things and how I changed the inventory bar and other related in-game menus for my game. What I liked about the initial chosen default setting in Adventure Game Studio is the fact that the GUIs only show up when you move the cursor to the edge of the screen, and otherwise it leaves a clear view of the game world. However, I prefer the GUI to show up at the bottom of the screen. And I decided not to have the inventory list directly on screen whenever the cursor moves there, but instead show two things: a backpack icon, which represents the player character's inventory, as well as a notepad and pen icon, which represents the character's progress log and game menu. Those two icons are a much better fit for the specific game that I'm creating. They show up when the cursor moves down here, and I decided to make them semi-transparent and only fully rendered when the cursor is directly above them and they are ready to be clicked. Clicking the backpack brings up the inventory in the center of the screen like this. To avoid having to always move the mouse down to the backpack icon, the inventory can also be opened and closed by pressing tab on the keyboard. Clicking the notepad and pen opens this menu, in which the game captures the player's progression through the story and where you can find the game's configuration settings, save and load options for custom save points, the options to quick and go back to the main menu, or go back to the current scene of the game. Speaking of the current scene that we see here on screen, which is the kitchen area of a log cabin, which will be an important location in my game. If you would like to see the creation process for that location and all the pixel art lessons I learned during the process, you can check out this video next, and I will see you there in a bit.